If you've been looking for a high-performance all-in-one cooler, then you might have considered Lian Li's Galahad II lineup, the Galahad II Lite and the Galahad II Trinity Performance model. These are two 360mm all-in-one coolers with subtle RGB on the pump and stealth performance fans on the radiator. I built them both into the Be Quiet Light Base 600LX so I can show the thermal differences and talk about the differences between them in terms of installation and more. This video is sponsored by Lian Li, so I can give you my thoughts on these two and show you what they're like and the different highlights between them. The good thing about these coolers is they can be used with stealth builds, so you can see it here, for example, in the Evo XL with the Trinity Performance model, or I've even put push-pull fans on there for a really stealthy look, or you could swap them out for Lian Li's uni fans and have more RGB across the case. But for the purposes of this video, I'm sticking with the standard installation with the standard fans on the radiator and then just building it into the case and testing it to show you what it's like. Naturally, both all-in-one coolers will work with a variety of setups and different socket motherboards, including both Intel and AMD builds, and you've got all the parts necessary in the case for that. I've also talked about this in the separate wiring guides that I'll link to in the description, where I've gone into a lot of detail on both of these and how to get them set up. But what you'll find is the Galahad II Lite is really easy, very straightforward installation on either Intel or AMD, whereas the Trinity Performance is a little bit more complicated. However, with those performance fans on the radiator and Lian Li's usual logic of unifans interlocking and end up with just a single cable, the wiring is really straightforward and the setup is great. And obviously having performance fans on your radiator makes a difference to the cooling performance, which I have actually shown in the Galahad II Lite review, where I showed what happens if you use different fans on the radiator as well. The Trinity Performance model is also interesting in a number of other ways, because you'll see, for example, that the tubes on the radiator itself can actually be rotated, so you can rotate them at certain angles so that you can then change the position of the tubes to neaten them up in your build and to keep things nice and tidy. So not only on the pump end, but also on the radiator end without concern about leaking. With the Trinity Performance model, you can also remove the standard cap, so that one that has the Lian Li logo on it can be twisted off. Now, this is a nice setup here, as standard with that logo, I think, with the mirror effect on it, but you can choose this dazzle mode instead, where you can put some opaque caps on there for more RGB shine through, or this sinkhole one with a mirror in the middle and then bright RGB around the edges. More on that later on, because you can also customize the RGB lighting naturally, as you'd expect. What you'll see with the Lite model is the wiring is really easy. Out of the pump, you have two cables, and out of the fan, you have one. So you've got two cables on the pump, one that goes to the AIO pump header, and one that goes to the 5V RGB header. And then you've got another cable coming out of the three fans on the radiator that simply connects to the CPU fan header. This is really straightforward. It gives you a motherboard and BIOS control of all the fans and the pump really easily, and the setup is very straightforward. Meanwhile, the Trinity Performance is a little bit more complicated because, as you'll see, you have SATA power, you have a USB connection coming out of the pump, so those things need to be plugged in and connected. And then you've got that AIO pump header. And on the fans, you've got the CPU fan header and then a controller, which you can adjust the speed of the fans on the radiator manually. You also have this additional 5V RGB cable that plugs into the pump itself and then connects to the motherboard. Now, this gives you options because you can either control the RGB lighting via your motherboard software, the 5V RGB connection, or you can use L-Connect, Lian Li's software, to control the lighting via that USB connection. So you have options there, but it does mean it's a little bit more complicated. The other thing to note is that the Lite model is very straightforward in terms of the mounting. You have a bracket for both of these if you're using an Intel motherboard, whether it's LGA 1700 socket, for example, or the newer 1851 or older generations. You have the ability to install those pretty easily, and then obviously putting on the washers. It's a slightly different setup depending on whether you're using Intel or AMD, and as I said, I've done a bit more in-depth guide on this that I'll link to in the description. But in terms of the pump setup, it's very straightforward because the brackets on the cooler are the same whether you're using Intel or AMD. The only difference is what you have to do to the motherboard instead. So you can see with this AM5 motherboard, you have to remove the pre-installed brackets above and below the CPU and swap them instead with the ones that are included in the Galahad II Lite box. So these bracket onto the motherboard in place of those standard ones, and then you simply sit your cooler down over the top of those. This makes life a lot easier. It's the simple little things with the design here, but it means you don't need to worry about removing any brackets from the pump itself, whereas the Trinity Performance model you do. Now you get some thermal paste supplied with both of these all-in-one coolers, and a spatula for applying it, and these stickers, which you're meant to put over the copper plate on the pump. They apply the thermal paste to it and then peel it off. Now I've used this before on previous Lian Li coolers, and done it as instructed, but I'm very clumsy and I don't like this method because it ended up being quite messy. The idea is fairly straightforward. You apply the thermal paste here, you use the spatula to spread it out across those hexagons, you then pull the sticker off, and you then have a reasonable amount of coverage for your thermal paste that you can then seat down over the cooler. What I found, however, is doing this was messy, and you can see that it's not come out perfectly there. I personally prefer to apply the thermal paste directly to the CPU, so that's what I've done with this setup. Now I'm using the Ryzen 7 9800X3D in both of these tests, so both builds is exactly the same specs, just so you're aware of that. And I'm using a thermal paste guard from Noctua here to stop some of the thermal paste spilling over the edges. But the idea here is to basically try and make this test as uniform as possible. So we basically have the same setup to be able to show you the thermal performance difference here in a little while, both in gaming and in benchmarking, and show you how we get on there. You need to remove, obviously, the sticker from the copper plate as well to protect that before the installation, and then you just seat down the Galahad II Lite over that bracket, screw it down and secure it nicely. Really easy installation, especially for AMD, but both Intel and AMD setups are very straightforward with the Galahad II Lite, and if you're looking for the easier build, I'd say this is it. Now, the Galahad II Lite doesn't have a removable cap in the same way as the Trinity, but you can take off that Lian Li logo, and then you can rotate it. So this is useful if you want to put the tubes in a different position on the cooler. So if you had them to the side rather than the bottom as they are as standard, because you can rotate that Lian Li logo around to fit your build. And then with everything wired up properly, this cooler is just simply controlled by your motherboard, so you don't need Lian Li software for it or any other additional software in order for it to run. There's more included with the Trinity model because, as you can see, you've not only got the pump caps, but you also have a different setup, so you do need to take the brackets off the cooler, for example. It comes bracketed for Intel as standard, and if you want to use AMD as I am, then you need to replace the standard bracket with this one. Now, these are minor points, but it shows you there's more steps to the installation process as you're going about it. Similar sort of logic though, standoffs sit on the motherboard, need to be put on there, and then you need to peel the sticker off and apply the thermal paste and seat the cooler down over the top. But the wiring is more complicated, as I've shown, and the installation is a bit more fiddly. And obviously you actually have more cables coming out for the pump as well. So you've seen, obviously, we've got all those additional cables with the SATA power, USB connection, 5-volt RGB header, and the pump cables as well. But there are some nice little features about the Trinity. For example, it comes with this little tie that you can use on the pump tubes to neaten things up. And as I've said, you can rotate the tubes from the radiator as well, so you can angle things nicely. And you've got more cap options. So there's some interesting highlights here in terms of what you can do and what's included. More complicated to install, but more options in terms of how to set it up and make it look nice and get it to fit nicely into your build. Obviously, having the ability to swap out the pump cap can be a nice addition too, and that's not an extra purchase, it comes as standard. Now, what you'll notice here, though, is that the RGB on the pump doesn't match the fans in my case. With the Trinity model cooler, you obviously can use L-Connect. You can go into the L-Connect software and you have a couple of options. So you can press the motherboard RPM sync button to sync the pump speed with your motherboard software or with the BIOS, or you can control the speed directly from L-Connect with various different pump profiles, quiet, standard, high speed, and PWM mode. In the lighting section, you can also choose to either sync with the motherboard or use L-Connect. So if you're using other Lian Li fans, it might make sense to do that. But if you want to sync with the motherboard software, you can do that. And in my case, I'm using RGB Fusion so I can sync the RGB lighting of the pump with the fans in the case, so the Be Quiet fans, which are also connected to a 5-volt RGB header. That way, as you can see, the lighting now matches and it looks a lot nicer. So now let's get into the thermal performance testing. So I started with OCCT, running obviously in both instances in both builds, so I can show you the performance here. And what was interesting is the Lite model actually was a little bit toastier at 75 degrees versus 67. That's obviously the max temperature that the CPU got up to. So quite interesting, because what I found is that running other tests, the Galahad II Lite actually ran cooler. And an interesting result from Cinebench was that the temperatures here look very similar on paper, but actually what I found is that with 3 runs on either of these setups, the Galahad II Lite resulted in a better score. So I got 1330 points versus 1215 with the Trinity model. So I think it was probably running cooler throughout the testing period rather than just looking at the max top end of it. So then I did a TimeSpy Extreme benchmark. Obviously, these are all synthetic benchmarks testing, comparing the data here. You'll see we've got a little bit better score with TimeSpy Extreme using the Galahad II Lite. The temperatures, once again, were very similar, though, maxing out at 68 degrees with the Galahad II Lite, 69 with the Trinity. Well, what happens if we have a look at overall gaming performance? Now, note, of course, I've only got 3 intake fans in this case. There's no intake fans on the bottom, just 1 exhaust fan at the rear, and then exhausting through the radiator. But doing this, I'm getting about 51 degrees on the CPU when playing Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 on the Galahad II Lite, 4K with maximum graphics settings. So actually really good cooling performance here. And then just switching to the Trinity, doing the same sort of logic. I'm basically playing a variety of different games here to show you what it was like. And you'll see here somewhere around 46 to 50 degrees in temps on the CPU, but the frames are a little bit lower, interestingly. Obviously, this is going to vary quite a bit, but my overall experience in testing these two is that we're getting around 50 degrees C on the Ryzen 9 800X3D, which is actually pretty good. I thought it was very good performance considering we've only got 3 intake fans. So here you can see the 2 results side by side with the performance in ready or not. So you can see again here, trying to push 4K graphics, make the most of that. With the Trinity, the FPS was a little bit lower, but the temperatures are quite comparable. I feel like a little bit toastier in this instance on the Lite, but as you can see, it's pushing more frames in this section as well. So that was quite interesting too, I think, is that basically they're quite comparable. And the other thing I want to talk about is the noise levels, which we'll get to in a second. But then we're on to Stalker 2. This is another quite punishing game, and obviously I'm not running necessarily the top-end GPU in this system, so it's worth bearing that in mind. But what you'll see is that we, again, looking at around 50 degrees, just below 50 degrees on the CPU during this gaming session. So across a variety of games, that's basically what we're getting. It's 50 degrees out of CPU, under load, while pushing pretty high-end graphics on a 4K display. It's pretty impressive. Indiana Jones, same sort of thing we're playing here and testing it out. Also, what I found is that basically during gaming sessions, neither of these all-in-one coolers is overpowering in the amount of noise levels it's putting out. And I'll leave you a test of that in a minute. I do find perhaps that the Trinity 2 is a little bit louder. This is a personal feeling. I feel like the Lite ran a little bit quieter in the system. Obviously, this is going to vary depending on the case fans that you've got and your system, your graphics card, and more. So now stick around to hear a sound test to hear the difference between the two. Don't forget to check out our links in the description to find out more, and also to see the full specs of this build. This has been the Provoke Prawn. Thanks for watching.
Not a chance. I think
Thanks very much for watching. If you've made it this far, I really appreciate you. Consider subscribing if you haven't already, and give me a thumbs up because that really helps. Drop a comment down below if you've got any questions, and watch these other videos. And most importantly, have a great life.